Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's interview. Today, we are sitting down with Brock Beard, the man himself. Brock, how are you doing today?
Doing great, doing great. Thank you for having me on.
Awesome. A lot of people here, they'll know you from your series on YouTube as well as Last Car, the website dedicated to the race that a lot of times doesn't get covered. So, hopefully, people can learn a little bit more about that as well as some of these awesome projects you have going on.
Oh, thank you very much. Yeah,
Uh,
yeah. So the rise of the field fillers has been the big series on the YouTube channel, and following a lot of these different small teams, especially around the 2004 season when they
mhm,
became kind of a big story behind the scenes of the first NASCAR Nextel Cup season, the first chase, and a lot of changes that year. Storyline that doesn't really get a lot of historical views there, but definitely one that I remember very clearly from following the sport back then. And it's been fun to kind of catch up with a lot of these different drivers. Actually, just most recently, I've been speaking with Stanton Barrett about doing his episode on that.
mhm,
And of course, since one thing I needed to kind of think a bit more about going into this particular episode is, of course, Stanton Barrett, as well as his father, have a long history in Hollywood working as
mhm.
stuntmen. So them looking at a script, they're definitely going to have a lot of notes, and that's kind of where we are right now.
Mhm.
We're in the process of getting that rewritten, and I'm confident that the final product is going to be a very good episode
Mhm.
coming up here. But it's been pushed back a little bit. I got another video I'm in the works on getting
Mhm.
ready on the channel, and I hope to have some more news on that in the near future.
But that's awesome because I know with NASCAR YouTube, it's one thing I enjoy is you have some people that just every day they'll put out, might be a little 2 minute blur, but they have some content they're creating, and that's one thing that with your content that like it. I hate that there is a gap between them, but when it does come out, what I love is I know that I'm going to get whether it's 20 minutes, whether it's an hour and a half, I know that I'm going to just love every second of it. Ton of info, ton of all kinds of stuff in it. Which I guess, speaking of the rise of the field fillers, what exactly sparked the idea to do that series?
It's a good question. After we were talking a little bit before the show about my,
Mm,
my first book on JD McDuffie, and the Field Fillers is actually going to be my next book. The
okay.
Because I think it was going to have a lot of very similar, something to kind of bring the context of talking about JD McDuffie and being an owner driver in an underfunded
Mhm.
operation, and bring it into a more current timeline. I mean, to me, 2004 doesn't feel like that long ago, although I'm sure to you and probably a lot of your viewers as well, it's quite a ways ago still. But it was time that I really felt that this it was maybe the last stand of a lot of these small teams, and we've seen other ones, and there's still some of them today. But really, the concept of somebody that's like a shade tree mechanic and just
Mhm.
putting together a car, and running on a very small budget. 2004 really had that. I mean, guys like Morgan Shepherd um, these other organizations that were, trying to go Stan Hoover's team, Kirk Shelmerdine's team. I mean, organizations, that have with people that have been in the sport a very long time, trying to make ends meet for a very long time. And as it happened, back then, I mean, that was really an experience that really stuck with me. And I thought it was going to be a book. I put all the research together
Mhm.
and I started writing the book. But then it felt like the more I was writing it, the more I was just transcribing stuff I was seeing in videos, like qualifying footage and so forth.
Mhm.
And it really occurred to me, it's like, well, look, this is probably going to be better as a video series because then I don't have to transcribe all this. I could show you the clips. And thankfully, Brian Hallman at the BRH Racing Archives reached out to me. He and I have spoken for years
Mhm.
because we both share that common interest in really obscure paint schemes and stuff like that. And Brian has this incredible archive that it sounds like he's still in the process of making into a publicly available site there. He's been very helpful in sharing with some of his collection to make these videos even better because the visual aspect is really important. When you have a
Mhm.
subject that's obscure, there's fewer things for you to point at, and I know that I don't want it to necessarily turn into a slideshow, but the obscure paint schemes and stuff like that are something I know a lot of viewers really enjoy
Yeah.
from that one, and that's definitely something I want to kind of keep going in that series.
That's awesome. Because I know even for me, like as I've interviewed designers, it's really struck me with how there's so many paint schemes out there that have a story behind it. Whether it's something that with the driver, the sponsor, with the designer. And I remember asking one guy, he's DC2 Designs. He's with GMS, and he talked about how his like Mount Rushmore paint schemes. There was one of them where I believe it was Kyle Busch's the Rowdy NASCAR, and he was saying that the like neon orange slash red they used, they had to create that color. Like that color did not exist, and yet they were able to like create that color. And it's just now whenever I see a paint scheme, I always think, what's the story behind this? It might just be a regular car they threw a couple of stripes on, but there also could be a hour long conversation about how this came to be. So that's sounds like a really really cool project.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I really do think that. I mean, you always hear this: a picture speaks 1,000 words.
Mhm.
I think that when you look at a paint scheme, that's part of the story. And what the example you brought up is a perfect example of it. I mean, it's just the different things that came together, whether it's the paint scheme or a color that's used, or if it's a sponsor that comes on board,
Mhm.
or if they have the sponsor or the company or the logo on there as a particular tie with the driver themselves. I mean, Morgan Shepherd, for example, with the Racing with Jesus logo
Yeah.
that he had all the way through his most recent starts a couple of years ago. There's a story behind that, and that's what makes it really interesting. And that's
Mhm.
where I think and I think it's encouraging people to kind of look at things more that way. And again, you mentioned with like Kyle Busch. I mean, it's not something that's limited to small
Yeah.
teams, and I think that that's something that can only help people learn more about the sport and appreciate it in a way that's a little broader than maybe people would expect.
Mhm. Um, with your rise of the field fillers, has there been one that has stood out to you as your favorite one so far?
I would say Andy Belmont's has been my favorite so far, but there's other subjects coming up
Mhm.
that certainly Stanton's. I mean, from the discussion that we had when he was giving me kind of his preliminary notes on the script there, it's like, man, I think just the information from that
Yeah.
phone call could have been the next video. Unfortunately, I couldn't get um, my recorder out quick enough there for that, but we're going to go over that again. But
Mhm.
um, the Andy Belmont one was very similar to that because Andy was so much of an open book, and there's a direct correlation between the episodes where not only am I'm able to speak with people that are involved with the team, but
Mhm.
where it's the longer the interview is and the more content there is in there. I think Andy Belmont literally spoke with me for, gosh, it was like 3, maybe 4 hours. It was a very, very long interview around the holidays, and it was a while ago. It was about a couple
Mhm.
of years ago. I was planning on doing the episode later in the series. That's why it took longer to do it. But fantastic details. I mean,
Mhm.
all the stuff about, and really kind of similar to what I was talking about with the JD McDuffie deal, talking about, he had two very clear cycles of trying to get into the Cup Series in 1992
Mhm.
versus 2004. And it really kind of brought up like, how NASCAR approached like his team back then versus 2004. And I
Yeah.
think that really came across in the video. And Andy himself was very happy with the video too. I actually spoke with his son, Kyle, who's on the Daytona 500 winning crew for Austin Cindric's team
Oh
at
wow.
Fontana the following week, and he enjoyed the video too. So we had a great discussion on that. The interview for that is actually on my Patreon.
Mhm.
But yeah, it was an enjoyable project. Andy is a very outspoken individual, and yeah, and there's other ones where people haven't been as open to speaking.
Yeah.
Andy Hillenberg said very frankly that that was not a fun time in his career in
Mhm.
2004. He didn't want to talk about it, which was unfortunate because I would have hoped we could have had conversations about things he did enjoy, like
Yeah.
qualifying for the 2000 Indy 500. Hermie Sadler is an extremely, probably Hermie Sadler and Stanton Barrett are probably two of the most busy individuals I've ever
Yeah.
tried to reach out to. They're constantly, you can see it on social media. They're
Mhm.
constantly doing this or that and jet setting here and there. Unfortunately, I had to do Sadler's episode without reaching out to him. I hope he likes the episode.
Mhm.
I really try to paint these drivers in the most positive way
Yeah.
possible. I know that the statistics may not show it that way, but there's a lot of stuff that happens in between.
Yeah.
And and I anticipate with the future episodes that's going to be the same.
I feel like that is so fascinating because I know in our first interview we kind of talked about the last car thing, and I think you've been touched out. Some people they're like, okay, this is cool, and other people they're like, well, I really don't like being highlighted for finishing back in the pack. But for a lot of these people, I think that is something that they I don't know. I guess they don't realize people out there just they appreciate even if they finished back there. There's people that loved it, and I remember talking to Charles Lewandowski about how he had a starting park car, and they had just slapped some numbers on their I guess backup for the primary car, and for him that time in his life probably sucked because he's sitting there, he qualifies, he runs 5 laps, and then pulls out and says, "Oh, transmission's gone," or whatever. But here's this random kid that's like, my folder at school, I had Dale Jr.'s car, Mike Waltrip's, and then his car right there. And I was like, for him it sucked, but for me, I'm like, man, one day I wish I hope I could meet this guy because I love this paint scheme.
Yep. Yep. See, and that's the greatest thing. I think, there's I really believe that the back end of the garage area, although there's a lot of, it's very raw back there. You got, whether it's the Cup Series, Xfinity, or trucks, or, even lower divisions as well, in ARCA or the West Series. It's very difficult. You got guys out there that are absolutely scrapping where their big accomplishment is even qualifying for the race.
Yeah.
Much less. And then, of course, you mentioned Charles with the starting parks too. A lot of times that's a reality where they just have to do that to make ends meet, or maybe help one of their teammates. But I think every time I cover a race weekend, that's like the first place I go to is as far into the garage area as possible. I do my media work there. I'm looking to do that again in Las Vegas next week. Because I got to know what's going on. And I know that they don't usually get a lot of coverage.
Yeah.
And I know it's because it's not that glamorous and they're not really going to be contenders for the win most often. Sometimes at like plate tracks or super speed road courses, sometimes they can, kind of levels the playing field a little bit. I'm always fascinated by it. And what I like to do in a lot of my current coverage is really try to bring that out for people who aren't able to be back there, and I know I'm applauding that in NASCAR, there's more and more people that are back there and they're kind of checking things out, and that's good to see. But I also like to just make sure that, to just get as much information as I can about what's happening back there. I mean, like the Truck Series deal with G2G at Sears Point. Out of nowhere, that kind of just dominated my coverage for that weekend. I mean, I think it was actually a little bit to the detriment of my Cup coverage that weekend. But it ended up being like, sometimes that's what happens. It'll be like a big story with a lot of ins and outs. But I mean, ultimately, if you look at the race results and just say, oh, well, it's Stephen Parsons, he ran 5 laps, who cares? It's like, no, there was a heck of a lot that happened before that even happened. So those they're fascinating to me because think about how much of the sport's history. I mean, thankfully, there are places like NASCAR scene and, Steve Wade, Rick Houston, a lot of their writers, when you had that, they covered a lot of ends of the garage. Ned Jarrett mentioned JD McDuffie always being on his radio show. I think there used to be a little bit more of a broader interest in some of these other teams, but I think nowadays, people kind of they're not all everybody in media, but there's definitely a segment of it that I think anticipates a story coming to them. And maybe, or, and I know there's a lot, the sport is very front loaded now with its playoff format, and it's very easy to just focus on the playoff guys and then focus on a smaller and smaller group of the playoff guys. But of course that ignores a larger and larger portion of the field. Yeah. I know that's a part of it, and I don't blame them for that. But I think that makes it even more important to kind of focus on some of these teams back there. Yeah, that's something I really enjoy, and I know a lot of my readers do as well.
You previously announced that you're currently working on a Derek Cope biography. Do you have any updates on that project?
Not any new updates from our last discussion, but I am. I've been speaking with Rob Taylor, who is a motorsports artist out of Canada. We stayed with him actually when we covered the race action at Mosport for the Truck Series back in 2019. Great guy. We had a great time up there, and he spotted for Norm Benning that weekend as well. So it's we definitely share the same interest in these smaller teams, and with Cope. I reached out to him with some pictures that Brian Hallman provided. and I was working on some cover illustrations with him. We're kind of arranging that at the moment. And then hopefully what I'd like to do is get it submitted to my editor and get it ready for print over this winter. I mean, the manuscript, I'm pretty happy with it, but I want an editor to look at it because I
Yeah.
know it's going to be, it needs that. It definitely needs that. Much like the notes with the Stanton Barrett thing.
Yeah.
I'm waiting to get those notes and put the finishing touches on it because it's been really since 2018 when the JD book came out that I've been working on this one. And I'm ready. I want to get it out there. I know Derek and Alicia have been looking forward to it, and they've been very patient with me. But I don't want to drag it any further than it has to.
Well, I'm really looking forward to it. I appreciate your attention to detail too. I remember a few years ago, I was reading through a book, and I was like, who are they talking about? And I started researching, trying to figure out who this person was, and I figured out they had mispronounced or misspelled Chip Ganassi's name. So I was trying to figure out like who Galassi was, and then finally I was like, "Oh, that's the problem." So I know as a NASCAR fan, I appreciate your attention to detail with the book. So,
no, thank you. I mean, nobody's perfect. I mean, I mess things up too, and my readers are really, really good at trying to keep me on point as much as possible. It's and I think that's very important. I think that if you hold yourself out as a as a professional or as somebody that is covering this beat, you need to be held to account, and I think that's very important. And it's not easy to handle criticism and stuff like that, but I mean it's warranted. You understand that it's because they want to make sure that it's a check to make sure that you're doing what you need to do. So that's really been a big thing too. But and I think that's so important today in media of any kind, really. I know that social media is always a controversial thing, and that aspect of it. And of course, I am active on social media as well. But I think especially these days, there's so many outlets out there for people to kind of express themselves. I think it's even more important than ever for people to be the change they want to see in the world. If you see that other people are making a lot of mistakes or they're not doing their research, you need to go out there and put your stuff out there and make sure you're doing those things. And then people want to read that, and then that's going to speak volumes about where things go. I think that's really important.
For typical NASCAR fans, we've noticed that the new car has brought new faces to the front of the pack. As someone who focuses a lot on the back half, in your opinion, do you think the next gen car has really brought a lot of like diversity to the field, or do you feel like it only goes so far and really shaking up the field?
That's a very good question. I do believe I like the trajectory of the sport with the new partners and teams that are coming in. I think that what we've seen from 23XI and from Trackhouse and from these other organizations that are bringing on Colleague Racing is another great example. Programs where the team owners have just so much excitement and they're just into it, and they're bringing new fans into it. And they've breathed new life into drivers that were just kind of having, kind of difficult parts in their careers. Certainly Suarez, and even to an extent, Bubba Wallace, although his star was on the ascendancy already. It's fantastic. I think that's great. And I think seeing a lot of these programs on the rise is great. I've always been a huge advocate for any new teams because I want to know more about them. That's the other thing I want to look at. I look at the back of the field and I want to know if there's anybody new, if there's a new team or a new driver that's coming in. That's why I like doing my entry list storylines articles each week too, because nowadays silly season is every week. It's not at the end of the year. So now you got to really track. I mean, this weekend, for example, you got Marco Andretti and Connor Daly going to be running at the Roval. That's really exciting. And people need to make sure that they're aware of that. The more press that's getting, the better. The problem I have, however, is the current dynamic of the charter system in the Cup Series, because now we're in a situation where through, really what I think was just kind of unnecessary is now you can't have a new team come in without a team closing. And there's been teams that have closed before, and I know that's where their mindset was when this was created. Of course, Petty Enterprises isn't out of Level Cross anymore. Bud Moore Engineering's not around. The Wood brothers have been absorbed into Roush and now Penske. A lot of that has changed, But back then, it didn't require a team to close for a new team to start up. A lot of times, a startup team would come from that team, and then maybe a couple other programs would start up, like a Team Red Bull or something, would just completely come out of nowhere.
Yeah.
And it was great. But nowadays, if you want to get into the Cup Series, you have to basically have a charter. You just have to. We've seen some open teams this year, but we've only had one race all season with 40 cars on the entry list. And 40 itself is less than what we used to have with 33 car fields not too long ago. That is the problem I have, because as excited as I am, because now it's hindered a little bit, where I hear like, okay, well, maybe Childress wants to expand to 3 cars again. Maybe this program wants to start up. There's that 3 friends team that's coming in next year. They want to do this. It's like, okay, well, we know that they're not going to probably want to be an open team, because that's not going to be profitable, even for an expansion team from a current program. But, okay, now I'm forced to consider which team is going to have to give up a charter. Whereas it used to be maybe sometimes like the field fillers thing. You had only 39 full-time Cup teams, and the next year you had 45. So 2 fully funded cars would go home each week, but it wouldn't be the same ones each week. And it always went up and down. But now we got this glass ceiling here, and it can only just boom, 36. It's going to hit it at 36 each time. And every time it hits, somebody at the bottom of the field is going to lose it. And Derek Cope, in the Derek Cope book, it was, one of the reasons I had to update it, of course, was when their team shut down with Starcom Racing, and they didn't want to leave. Derek and Alicia didn't want to leave. Their partners, Matt Kohler and those folks, they didn't want to leave. But they were basically forced to, because under the terms of the charter, you can't finish that low in points in a certain number of years. And, then your charter is auctioned off and you don't get the money. The whole point of having a charter is, it's unfortunate, because now that's the paradigm. Whereas now, Denny Hamlin, I think, had his interview on the Dale Jr. Download, where you can't even add other charters now, because now there's a whole, they've boxed themselves in the same way Formula One has, where now everybody's gonna be like, well, wait a minute, I don't want a new team to come in, because now my charter's gonna be worth less. Whereas before, that was what Rob Kaufman was arguing, where he said, like, oh, these start and park teams, they're making our teams worth less money, even though there wasn't anything to back that up. But now they've created a system where now you don't have start and park organizations, and you've completely stymied growth. And it's so sad when you compare it to the Xfinity series and the Truck Series, where we have had large fields, large entry lists, several teams sent home. We're seeing it again this weekend at the Roval for the Xfinity series, and a lot of great programs in there. I didn't grow up enjoying like the Busch series. Like, I didn't really follow the series that closely, but I'd say they're putting on some of the best shows out there. And it has this wonderful mix of top teams and mid-tier teams, and then the lower funded teams. And and Truck Series, very much the same thing. You can lay them out very easily as to who's in which group. But the Cup Series has kind of lost that, which is sad. And although it's great that we're having these different winners, and that the series is competitive within that bubble of 36 teams, the restriction to 36, I think, is something that stymies long-term growth, and it doesn't encourage teams to stay in there for a very long time. It's a system that I believe is built on failure, because it's not that something, Hendrick Motorsports was just given these assets, for example, or Joe Gibbs or Penske, teams that were never going to shut down, that they were never in any danger of losing sponsors or anything like that. Now they have this added asset on top of it. It's a windfall, really, for them. But for these other programs, it's now like a lit fuse, and and that fuse may just run out, and they're just going to be out, even if they're not ready to go. And we've already seen it with so many programs that have been lost. So, long answer to your question, but I think there's a lot of positives. I love the people that are coming in. I just don't like what we're losing to bring them in. That's what I'm looking at.
Yeah, me and a friend were talking the other day about, like, it's crazy how people, you'll see this one solution and you'll go, that's what we need, that'll fix everything. But people don't realize that solution. And because I know for me, I go back and forth where I look, and to your point, you look at all these teams that people came into the sport excited, and they left broke, and I'm like, well, that's not good. But then even nowadays, it's like, well, you got to have so much money to even make it viable, to be in the Cup Series. So then it's like, well, that's not really an answer, because now you don't have 45 teams showing up. You have your 36 teams showing up. And so yeah, I feel like it is a really interesting way to look at it, is like, what, we can't just look at all the pros of this. We also have to look at what could be the negatives of this.
Well, it's so sad to have that restriction put in place at a time where NASCAR has now created a spec car where,
Yeah.
like Kyle Busch said, you can literally buy it at Walmart. Like, if you want to have a startup team and you want to run in the Cup Series, if you didn't have the charters there, you could literally just buy these cars off. You maybe even buy a pre-assembled one off another team.
Yeah.
And you go right back to having a format that you had in the past. But of course, the teams aren't going to give this up now, because they're going to say, oh, well, look, if our team closes or if we want to sell, we're not going to make as much money on it, because now we're not, now we don't have people bidding on this charter for a finite number of spots. Now it's like I never understood that, where they said like, okay, they're only going to be able to sell the shop and the cars, as if that's not worth something.
Yeah.
Like, that's worth something. If it's still something that's active equipment. I mean, when owner driver operations shut down, their equipment was worth something to somebody. I mean, it's not going to be like, I guess enough to retire on, I guess, or whatever. What's the definition of enough? But it's not pennies either. I never understood that. And maybe that's my ignorance of it from my standpoint. But I think I really do think that a lot of this was, I don't even think it was made on good intentions. I think it was just made on a misunderstanding of what the problem was, and created a new one in its place.
I feel like it's crazy how I feel like there's so many of these subjects that it goes back to the field fillers and the people at the back of the field, and it kind of just goes back to prove the point of, that's why I feel like your stuff is so popular, and why like it is so important, is because a lot of these, it's almost like a lot of these changes are being led by the people who are, the top 5 guys at the front, your champions, whatever. And then it's the people at the back, people looking at, okay, how do we solve this? And it's just funny how you go back, and it's easy if you're, a casual fan, to sit there and say, okay, well, that's no big deal. So-and-so finished 30th for another time, when no, there'd be a lot of implications to that guy that's finishing 30th every week.
No, exactly.
I guess to end this, Brock, if you can look at all of the NASCAR paint schemes that hit the track over the years, do you have one that stands out as your all-time favorite NASCAR paint scheme?
My all-time favorite would probably still be Jerry Nadeau's Michael Holligan car from the 2000s, especially the second half of the 2000 season, where they kind of added some orange accents onto it. I think that balanced the scheme just beautifully. I've always liked schemes. I mean, kind of when you were talking about the Kyle Busch, the NOS paint scheme earlier, I always like that kind of electric orange kind of scheme. I always loved, Derek, well, really more the Tide rides. Those had that accent very well. But I've always mentioned that I love a paint scheme that uses white in a really good way. Like, it doesn't, like, not like an unsponsored car, but where it's part of like a really dazzling design. I think there's a lot of potential in that. And a lot of my favorite schemes, I think, kind of fall under that. And Nadeau's has this wonderful white where it's kind of fades to this like dark blue with a checkered flag pattern on it, a dark blue hood, and then these orange accents, like an orange border on the numbers. And it was just a showstopper. I remember seeing it at Sears Point, and it was just gorgeous. And those are kind of like schemes I like. I mean, there's other ones that I've seen, from other, from more recent years. And I think the ones I've been partial to fall under that too. I mean, I think of Buckshot Jones's car, the Georgia Pacific scheme in 2001, which had nice white details on it. I actually like Kevin Harvick's car that wrecked at the Roval last year in his battle with Chase Elliott. I like the white racing stripes up it. Kind of made it look like I almost thought it kind of gave like Herbie vibes or something like that on it. I thought it was pretty neat looking. Unfortunately, it's made the highlight reels in the wrong way, but that's part of it. But definitely the Jerry Nadeau scheme, and then by extension, like other ones that kind of use, I guess it's not really a color, but I mean, use that hue in a creative way.
I gotcha. Well, it's definitely an awesome selection. I know for me, Jerry's cars always stood out, whether it was the Cartoon Network or whether it was the like a Mulligan or even the U.S. I feel like he's the original. When I think of the U.S. Army car, I think of he was the
Yep.
original guy with that. But yeah, once again, Brock, thank you so much for joining us. For the people watching this, where can they find you at online to check out your other videos and books and such?
Yeah, no, the best places to check out my website is lastcar.info. My Twitter handle is at lastcaronbrock. If you're interested in Patreon, I got some bonus content and advanced access to my videos. Patreon.com/lastcaronbrock. And then my YouTube channel, just look up my name, Brock Beard, and it's got all the videos like we were talking about earlier here, as well as post-race live streams that start usually about 15 minutes after the checkered flag of each cup race. We have a good group in there. And, we just, we talk about everything. We talk about a little bit about the past, a little bit about the present, and certainly speculation about the future. So I try to cover it as much as possible. And at my website, also we have William Saki and Ben Schneider are the writers on the page there. They produce their content as well. And we're trying to grow things as best we can and get you guys more coverage. And like I said, trackside coverage coming next week in Las Vegas.
Awesome. Well, thanks again for joining us, Brock.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me on.